Hello, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Metz, and welcome to today's webcast titled Tips on Driving eSignature Adoption in Your Independent Agent Channel. This event is brought to you by Property Casualty 360 and sponsored by eSignLive by VASCO. I will be moderator for this event, but before we get to the topic, let's get some simple housekeeping items out of the way. This event is completely interactive and incorporates many of today's social media tools. You can tweet or directly post information to your Facebook and LinkedIn page right from the console. You don't have to open a new web browser to do so. Just scroll along the bottom of the screen and click on the social networking widget of your choice. We encourage you to do so. Also, if you have a question for one of our speakers, please enter it in the Q&A widget on your console. We will get to your question during the event or during the live Q&A at the end, depending on time. We will answer as many questions as possible, so we invite you to ask away. If we don't get to your question, you may receive an email response. In addition, there are some other customizable functions to be aware of. Every window you currently see, from the slide window to the Q&A panel, can either be enlarged or collapsed, so if you want to change the look and feel of your console, go right ahead. Finally, there will be some polling questions sprinkled throughout this event. We encourage you to participate in these polls, so please, when you see them pop up, go ahead and vote, and we will share those results with you. Now, let's get to today's topic and why you are all here today. Using e-signatures can streamline key processes, but many questions remain for insurers about how to use them properly to properly maximize ROI and how to ensure agents will be open to changing the way they do business. First-hand experience describing previous success and how to overcome challenges can help your organizations move forward. GAINSCO Auto Insurance added e-signatures to its new policy sales processes 2 years ago to reduce risk within its independent agent channel. It's been so successful that now they are looking for ways to expand the program. Joining us today are Andy Jordan, Senior Vice President of Corporate Marketing at GAINSCO Auto Insurance, and Andrea Masterton, Director of Corporate Marketing at eSignLive by VASCO. Before we pass off to Andrea, please take a moment to answer a poll that we're going to put on your screen right now. What do you think is the biggest barrier to further adoption of e-signature in insurance? Consumers are not ready, agent-distributor resistance, legal or regulatory concerns and restrictions, competing priorities preventing companies from expanding use, or there are no barriers, it's just going to take time. Please take about 45 seconds to answer the question, and we will go ahead and read the results and get this underway.
Is this where you sing for us, Jeff? Okay, do you want me to push the results slide, Jeff?
Yeah, let's go ahead and push those results. Okay. Andrea, why don't you go ahead and take it away? Go ahead and start the presentation by looking at the results.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. And thanks to everyone on the call for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. So as I'm looking at this quickly, scrolling down, looks like an even split, wow, between legal concerns, competing priorities, no barriers. Largest majority said agent-distributor resistance. Very interesting results. So thank you for participating in the poll. Your answers they're a great way to start the discussion. I was actually at an insurance conference just last week, and I asked the same question to the audience. And we actually spent a lot of time debating between A and E. So the first one, consumers aren't ready, which it seems like most of the folks on the call today are not feeling that's the obstacle, and then the competing priorities. So clearly the audience here today has differing and different opinions from what was discussed at that conference I was at last week. The one thing I think we can all agree on is that electronic signatures have been around for a long time. They were written into law almost 20 years ago. But despite significant progress and growing acceptance, and there has been a lessening of concerns around legality and enforceability, certainly based on the conversations we have. We know the solutions that are available in the market are quite mature. Despite all of that, we know there's a lot of work left to be done. Firstly, there's lots of companies that have yet to adopt e-signatures at all in the first place. And secondly, where e-signatures are in place, we're still not seeing the opt-in rates, the adoption rates that we know are possible. And that's what we're here to talk to you about today. That's really the focus of the webcast. So I'm glad you've been able to join us for sure. So when we talk about opt-in rates or adoption rates, what we mean is when e-signatures are offered in any given process as an alternative to paper, how many people are going to choose to go the digital route? So our consumers on board, our advisors and agents on board. We make it a practice to consistently measure adoption rates within our customer implementations. We routinely ask our customers for feedback on this. And from that feedback, we can see some clear trends. Unmediated transactions where a consumer is self-serving through a process on a website, for instance, will consistently get high, we're talking like 99% adoption rates. And as soon as you introduce a person, an advisor, into the equation, adoption goes down. So what does that tell us? That tells me at least that consumers, if left to their own devices, are ready for e-signatures. That they're ready for e-sign and there's no concerns or hesitation there. For mediated transactions, so when there is an advisor or an agent, whether that's independent or captive, when there's a mediator in the transaction, we know adoption is still going to vary based on where the transaction is taking place. So are documents being signed in person on a shared device like an iPad, so agent and customer sitting in an office location or perhaps at the consumer's home, or is the client sitting at home in front of their own computer, but perhaps working with a call center agent or working with their advisor over the phone? That question about where the transaction is taking place, in our experience, is the single most important factor in determining adoption and opt-in rates. So if the transaction is taking place remotely but still mediated, you'll see adoption drop from the 99% to about 90%, let's say. And then if the transaction is taking place in person with an agent, we see adoption closer to the 60%, maybe 70% in some cases range. And again, this is going to vary greatly. The actual number is going to vary from implementation to implementation, but the trends we see are consistent. That we definitely see a consistent trend there. So this is going to suggest that the problem isn't actually with the end consumers, which, based on your answers to the poll question, it sounds like everyone agreed with that, at least on the call today. It was that one gentleman from the conference last week that seemed to disagree with that, but it seems like we all agree that, end consumers aren't our concern, that it's really the advisors and the agents where there's concern. The good news is there's things that we can do to drive that adoption rate higher. And that's certainly what we're going to focus on today in this webcast. I think focusing on sales staff and agents and distributors is going to be key, but that's not the whole story. There are some other things that we can do. So for now, I'm going to hand the floor over to Andy from GAINSCO, who's going to share with us his company's experience with these signatures, like Jeff had mentioned, and what they're seeing in terms of adoption. And what's interesting about Andy's perspective is that he has experience at both ends of this spectrum. So, GAINSCO can tell us the story from both the direct and the independent agent perspective. And then after Andy is finished, I'm going to come back and wrap up with some of the practical implementation best practices that can help drive adoption further. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to you, Andy.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be able to talk to you today. As Andrea said, we have experience on both ends. I think it might be helpful to just talk a little bit about GAINSCO to set up our particular use case. And so, and then I can get into more of the details of our particular struggle. So GAINSCO is a minimum limits auto insurer. We write in 10 states. Almost all of the business that GAINSCO has ever done in its life has been through independent agents. And we did all of that business with wet ink signatures for many years. I've been here for 12 years since we started doing this, and for 10 plus of those years, we were a wet ink in the agent location, print out the application, and get it signed company. And we couldn't have really been a company that sold business in any other way because any remote transaction was just too difficult in the auto insurance space to do with wet ink. So as we were doing our shopping, and I started 3 years before we ended up with eSignLive, going to all the other people in the industry. When I talk about our particular independent agent struggles, some of you may understand that particular struggle, but even 3 years ago, it was very difficult to get somebody to understand that the auto insurance, somebody at an electronic signature vendor to understand that the e-signature transaction in an independent agent's office for auto insurance was not something that could be accomplished remotely. We couldn't be sure that the customer had a piece of technology such that they were able to receive a remote e-signature package and send one back. The need for insurance cards to be printed right on the spot and for the signature to happen quickly seemed to be overwhelming. And so we looked around and ended up with eSignLive because they were able to help us work through that. And we ended up having to do some changes with them inside even the process that existed with them at the time to make sure that we could get it done on the agent's computer inside the agency, an e-signature transaction. I see that I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself. The agents that we deal with are largely single location, low technology desktop computer on the desk. They deal with a variety of partners. By now, at least half the partners, or their carrier partners, probably offer electronic signature in some form or fashion. Even 3 years ago, it was the exception rather than the rule. We also have a portion of agents that are larger, that are multi-locations inside a city perhaps, that are sophisticated, have centralized call centers, maybe have electronic or like paperless file storage. Those people were crying out for e-signature, and other people weren't crying out for it at all, which sort of can tend to create the problem.
Andy, sorry to interrupt. Did you tell me the other day, what's the average age of your agent base?
The average age of the person that is transacting the business is the producer or even the customer service rep in front that sits in front in the agency, generally young, generally less educated, very, very good at doing what they do inside an agency, but not people who are highly technologically sophisticated. And so, again, another sort of barrier to any kind of a complex e-signature pathway. And when I say complex pathway, I mean if you were uncomfortable with an e-signature solution that was on the agent's computer, you might say, okay, well, hopefully the customer brought their phone in. So we'll somehow do a remote transaction that goes to the customer's phone as they're standing there. But then do all of our customers who are generally in a lower socioeconomic level have email on their phone, or maybe it has to be text? And if it has to be text, does that work? And what about the I actually went out in the field and saw some of our competitors that were using that kind of solution. The agent would just set it up to text the agent's own phone, and then the agent would sign it on behalf of the customers on their phone, which isn't a great solution either.
Certainly not. But the demographic of your agents might be a little bit different than some of the folks on the webcast here. We typically hear about an older demographic among the agent base out there. But I guess the commonality would be that whether it's an older demographic agent or, in this case, a younger demographic, the commonality is that they're not very tech savvy, right?
Absolutely, and that's a good point. We've had the states that we have the most trouble with are states. Oklahoma is our state that we have the lowest adoption, and the demographic that I talked about is somewhat true, but it's also true that at the other end we have people who have been agents for 30 or 40 years, and they're not technologically sophisticated. They're certainly late adopters of any kind of technological change. Which goes to another point that we should definitely talk about, which is, does it matter to the agent? And I think that would be appropriate as we get down the line a little bit in this conversation to talk about their own motivation to do it, which we've found to be our biggest problem. To go backwards just a bit, once we got a good partnership with eSignLive and were able to implement it, at the same time, we were launching a very modest direct sales operation here in our building. And as we got that kicked off the ground, we wanted to use eSignLive, obviously, to do all of those remote transactions. And thanks for switching the slide. That's perfect. And Andrea put up that slide with 99% adoption rates for online transactions. So, yes, as we sell business inside, online, through our online call center, really, it's the only way you can buy a policy from us. So because it only works that way, adoption is fine. In the online space, we have not had a problem. We keep people on the phone until they've gone ahead and completed the electronic signature. Not only are our adoption rates 100%, but our what I call our compliance rates, our rates of having packages that get completed within 48 hours is like 99 point something or 98 point something percent, because it's just easy, because it's obvious, I think, to the customer that the only way that they can get the transaction done that they want to purchase through this remote call center is by finishing up the electronic signature transaction. Having said that, we don't let people get off the phone, if at all possible, until they finish. So we're doing very well there. But our challenge is on the other side of the business. The 98% of what GAINSCO sells is in one of these 8,000 independent agents. So we finally got this up and running online in June of 2016, as you can see. We had a couple of test states, and we picked challenging states. We picked Oklahoma and New Mexico, which are, states that we really ran into some of these challenges of adoption with agents that have been doing things the same way for many years. We do electronic signatures on our direct new business, on our new business to our independent agents. We decided at the time that we implemented new business sales that we also needed to make sure that all the other transactions were capable of being done electronically as well. Because we thought it was sort of off-pitch to say, sell all the new business on this way, but when somebody wants to do an endorsement, use a wedding signature. So any transaction that an agent needs to do with GAINSCO for customers to use, and not having anything to do with claims, but just customer service, endorsing a vehicle onto the policy, reinstating the policy after a lapse, all of those things can be done through electronic signature as well. And we have basically the same performance in terms of e-signature penetration and utilization with all the different kinds of transactions. There's no real difference between that. It's sort of driven by the agent's own adoption. Once they adopt, they tend to use it. We have some limited claims transactions. We have the kind of the most simplistic implementation where our claims adjusters can create a custom template for perhaps a release for like a bodily injury release, and just attach an electronic signature to that document. We're doing that not in an enterprise-wide way, but just in kind of a limited way. It's definitely our next frontier at GAINSCO to tackle the claims transaction. I'll just step into and explain briefly. We wanted to make sure that we wouldn't have been able to basically fit it into our IT timeline to integrate electronic signatures unless we could use our current sales workflow and somehow attach electronic signatures into that workflow in a way that made sense. So traditionally at Bind, we had PDF forms that were generated, and then those forms were printed. So we basically created a scenario where the print function initiation just ended up creating the electronic signature package or the wedding package at the at the agent's request. So at the bind stage of our transaction with our GAINSCO Connect, our online system, after payment goes through, the agent basically has three options. Initially, we had all those three options presented on a page equally weighted. So they were all three side by side. You were able to see all of them. You could either do electronic signature in the office, electronic signature remotely, or you could do print paper forms, which was the equivalent of creating a wet ink signature experience. Since then, we have changed our headlining, and actually the paper option is a link at the bottom of the page. It's small, it's hard to find, and we're still fighting, a battle in terms of getting agents to not click on that mostly hidden link. They're still clicking. Their options up at the top of the page are in-office electronic signature or remote e-signature. Let me just give you a quick outline of the two kinds that we use. I know that in-office electronic signatures can be a little bit unusual. This is a use case that we need in the auto space. So in our world, customers walk into agents. Generally, often they pay with cash, but it's very transactional. They often don't have insurance, or even if they have fire insurance, they need insurance today. So they walk into the agency. The transaction has to go quickly. It has to be very streamlined. And in order to get electronic signatures and to meet our competitors, what they were already doing when we got to this implementation, we needed to be able to have the electronic signature transaction happen on the agent's computer in the agent's office. To do that, we do something that I guess in the industry is called the swivel. So literally the agent enters the information, and then the agent swivels the computer screen and passes the mouse across to the customer. The customer clicks to complete the transaction, and then the agent takes the computer back. We ask ourselves, our compliance people, we ask our counsel, and we ask coverage counsel that specialize in e-signatures multiple times to validate this electronic signature business process. And every single time they said that it was acceptable to do. We considered several steps along the way of additional validation. So maybe a text that went back and forth to the customer. And at each one of those points, we knew that we would be very out of step with the other companies that were in the space, and so our transaction would be deemed harder to use immediately because it had extra complex steps that other people didn't have. And counsel kept coming back and saying, "Nope, we think you can do it this way. It's fine." And then we have a remote e-signature path that I think is what most people would think of as a normal, sort of the normal transaction. It's certainly the basic transaction from eSignLive, where an email package is launched with a link. The customer clicks on the link and is driven through the process, and then the customer gets an email back. The one tweak that we have in it that has been very helpful for adoption, and we got this as a tip from somebody else before we implemented our solution, is that the customer in our space wants their insurance ID cards as soon as possible. So the confirmation e-signature that the customer generally gets that says you've completed your transaction and you signed these documents, that gives them a copy of the documents, for us also provides them with the ID cards, and that's kind of how we label that email. Here are your ID cards, and by the way, you completed your transaction. That's how they get their proof of insurance that helps them do what they need to do. in the remote space. So that helps drive utilization, and it helps drive completion of the electronic signature package. So about 90% of the time in our experience, when eSign is used, it's used in office. About 10% of the time it's used remotely. In overall, even though we've de-emphasized the paper option, in some states we're just above 50%, but all in, we're still struggling to reach 50% utilization after basically 12 months. And we're not super excited about that. We started in the 30s, in the 20s and 30s, so we've made progress, but that progress has been, incremental would be a fair term and not overstating it. It's just incremental progress. We're not really blowing the doors off. And then just we've integrated the electronic signature experience with our agency experience, so the agents can track the packages and track whether or not customers are completing them. And then at the end of the day, copies come to the company using our ImageWrite software, and they're available for the agent to see. So that's the e-signature journey at GAINSCO.
If I can make you feel better, Andy, if we think back to that continuum, that spectrum from the earlier slide, not only are you at the furthest right, where the independent agents are, but 90% of those independent agent transactions are taking place in person. So you're you've got the worst scenario.
Absolutely.
You've got the most challenging, absolutely. So
and I think,
yeah.
I appreciate you trying to make me feel better about it. I think Andrea wanted me to talk to you guys because I'm pretty honest about I'm not trying to sugarcoat our results. We wish it could be better, and at the end of the day, I'll tell you what we're doing to try to make it better. We have 100% adoption in the direct channel. We've grown our adoption in the IA channel. We see a variance in geography. In Texas has a lot of big cities, and it's been our experience that in agencies in the larger cities in Texas, electronic signature for many agents is the way they choose to do business. And if you don't have electronic signature, you're de-emphasized at the point of sale. It's exactly the opposite experience we have in more rural areas and in other states. So once an agency has understood that it makes sense for them, or if the use case just makes sense for them anyway, because let's say they're paperless anyway. Ironically, the very first agent I ever talked to about electronic signatures, which was probably 5 or 6 years ago now, was an agency group that was bought by a big insurance company. I won't name any names. But they forced them to start using electronic signature to complete all the transactions. But then they were still making them print out all of the documents, go into the back room, scan it all, and send it to the company's big sort of file room somewhere. So, that's an example of sort of they were able to compel that because they were a big company that had bought this agency group. But at the same time, that's not an elegant solution. So, that's the results that we've seen. Let's go to the challenges slide. I guess I can click it too, but thank you. When we started, all of our marketing messaging about agent adoption was based around the value, the value it provided to the agent to use electronic signature. It's better for you because of X, Y, and Z. And we were trying ease of use. We were trying, it makes it easier for you to, you can reduce paperwork and clutter. And then we sort of, as a secondary note, we said, utilize eSignature because it's also better for the company. It also protects you from E&O situations because there's always a record. It keeps you compliant because if you don't fill out every one of the electronic signatures that you need to do on a policy, you literally can't skip a signature that's supposed to be on like the 5th page back, which exposes you to E&O. We tried all of those qualitative things, and to be honest, they didn't really work. Agents are experts at doing what they do every day, and just people in general don't tend to change their behavior unless there's a compelling reason to change their behavior. And those benefits, no matter how clever we were at trying to create the words, they just weren't that relevant to somebody that their job is to sit there every day and sell policies. We were going for ease of use, but it's pretty easy to print something and put it in front of a customer and have them sign it. It's not that much harder. And I know it's funny because Andrea and I have had some interesting conversations about that. And if you live in an e-signature world, that seems, I think, that seems hard to believe. But it's just really difficult to push change unless there's a compelling reason why. And profitability arguments, it's better for the company, it helps the loss ratio. Those are just arguments are intellectually, they're not arguable, but they're not really compelling and behavior changing for agents that are in sort of there every day. If we would have been at the very front end of electronic signature adoption, we'd have been fighting an even harder battle. We've been successful mostly where people already do it with some other company. So I guess to cut to the point, what we're thinking about doing is to literally remove the print option and to compel utilization. And so we have a new state that we'll be rolling out in November, and every agent that we're setting up to do business within that new state, they're just going to see an experience that only allows them to have electronic signatures. And we feel pretty safe with that because, they'll never have known any other way of selling a policy with us. And then the next step is we're going to begin to select groups of agents and just turn the paper signature off and see what happens. And if we, it's one thing if people refuse to sell a policy with us. It's another thing if they just go ahead and make the transition because they're forced to. I would say that between our ultimate solution and in the early days, our messaging, we've changed our messaging, and we're not trying to sort of, convince people of the value. What we're saying is GAINSCO's preferred method of transacting business is through electronic signature. We would like you to use electronic signature. We're just basically asking them to do it instead of trying to convince them it's better for them to do it, because better for them didn't seem to be very compelling. So our sales reps, inside and outside sales reps, they're leveraging relationship, and they're leveraging, hey, we'd like you to comply with doing things the way we'd like you to do them. And a lot of our increase from in the 20s to in the 40s has been after we've gone ahead and changed that messaging. So I think that does work. It's just I don't like the slope of the line looks like it's going to take a really long time. And if we can get away piece by piece of compelling utilization without causing a lot of business upset, we're going to do that. Okay. Andrea? I think, unless there's some questions that anybody has, that's
yeah, we were going to open up to the audience questions. So, thanks for that, sharing your story, Andy. And where Andy just left off, we're curious to hear from you all in the audience and find out what your policy is on the use of e-signatures. So is it similar to, to what Andy was saying, or, do you require e-signatures on all e-apps so there's no option to print at all? Or, do you leave this really to the discretion of agents and your customers? So we'll give you a few minutes to answer that. This is where it would be nicer to have be at a conference with all of you where we could take you off of mute and actually have a conversation, but hopefully we can get a little bit of interactivity and feedback from you through the poll.
We do have some questions out there, and one of them you might want me to answer.
Sure, yeah, this is a perfect time while we're waiting for the poll results to come in. Go ahead.
Yeah, there was a question about, can you talk more about how you selected eSignLive versus some of the other e-signature players? I certainly can. I feel pretty good about the way we diligized that process. I started going to sort of electronic signature conferences long enough ago that pictures I took while I was there are showing up as like ancient memories in my Facebook feed. Really like 6 years ago, started asking the question. And like I said, we weren't able to find anybody that was hearing our use case. People would just try to convince me, no, you don't really mean that. You don't really want to have people selling it inside the agency on their computer. You don't want that. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. That's what's happening. We're not going to be able to change that. At least one of the other major players in the industry I felt like I had a very frustrating battle working with them to try to get them to understand the use case. They wanted to flatten it out, and they sort of wanted to tell me that that's not what we needed. And I knew that just a small fraction of our business happens remotely. I will say that the folks at eSignLive they listened to our problems, and even there, initially they couldn't figure it out either, I don't think, and we sort of worked together and figured out a way. We've had to change some things about the underlying default transaction, and if anything, I would just give high marks to the flexibility of getting there. GAINSCO depends on how you define size, but some of you come from really super large companies. I feel more comfortable dealing with a company that is of a size where I feel like I'm being listened to. So really it was do I want to get in the boat with these people? Do I think they're going to help me figure out solutions? And I felt like that was a good decision. But we diligized it with at least 2 of the other major players and then a couple of small ones. And that probably tells you everything you need to know.
Thanks, Andy. That's great. So it's a perfect key off to the best practices that I'm going to launch into next, one of them being flexibility of workflow. But before we get there, let's see what the results are to our question. So the vast majority is it's use at the discretion of agents. A very small percentage of folks say that we require e-signatures on all e-apps. These results don't really surprise me. I have to say, based on my experience speaking to lots of insurance companies, I think there's lots of different opinions on this. And different insurance companies seem to have different levels of comfort with what Andy just proposed, right? If anything, though, I think there is a growing trend. Like there's more companies, Andy, like GAINSCO that are moving in that direction, that are mandating the use of e-signatures, and for them the response has been okay. But what I'd like to do is let's have you back in a few months, and you'll have to give us an update on how things went.
Indeed. We know, just to the point, I don't think we would have stepped out into that space without knowing that some of our competitors were already there. And I think the larger issue, and Andrea probably could speak to this actually, because I'm sure the messaging inside her own talking about this has changed over the years. This is a solved problem. If you're on the phone and you're at the beginning of it or you haven't really crossed the bridge yet, to doing electronic signatures, the biggest thing that's changed is it's a solved problem out there. People are doing it every single day. So you're just introducing something that sort of makes you like other carriers instead of trying to explain to people just exactly what e-signature is. And I think that makes all of this so much easier.
Mm-hmm. That said, I'm still surprised at the high number of folks on the line right now that answered concerns about legality and regulatory and legal concerns still standing in the way. So I think that's a topic for another day. Interested to hear, is it legal concerns on the part of consumers? Is it the legal concerns on the part of insurance companies? Because that's certainly one area where I feel like we've answered that, haven't we? The courts have answered it. It's been out there. We know e-signatures and e-records are standing up in court, and there's there shouldn't be any concern about that anymore. So clearly some more work to be done there. So I just want to switch gears now. We're going to be running out of time soon, and I see some questions coming in. I want to stop picking on the agents for a little while. Because whether you're going to mandate the use of e-signatures or not, I think there's some simple best practices that you still want to make sure that you're following to make sure that your project is ultimately a success. So the starting point, I think, like Andy was mentioning, really for any good e-sign process is going to be the workflow. And last year, Forrester Research actually put out a research note. You see a little excerpt here from that report called eSignatures, A Few Simple Best Practices to Drive Adoption. And in there, the analyst Craig LeClaire points out that the signing experience is absolutely the top driver of e-sign adoption. So what does that mean? What do we mean when we're talking about e-signature workflow? So the starting point is that e-signatures should absolutely integrate seamlessly into your existing systems and processes. And I can't remember I think you called it the agent experience, Andy. So, you have to think about wherever your print button is located today in your process, you want to replace it. That's right, Andy. not just hide the print button. You want to ideally replace it with a send for e-signature button. So, we often hear well, it has to be as easy electronically as on paper. I would challenge us, it actually needs to be easier than paper if we really want to compel use and adoption. So I guess the point here is that you really want to keep the reps and the drivers of the transaction in the environment that they're already familiar with. And then, once the documents are handed off, once that send to e-signature button is pressed, your eSign platform is going to take care of basically these 7 workflow steps that you see here. And these are the steps that are needed to gather the legally enforceable signatures and then hand those final secured and signed records back to your downstream, your policy admin system or whatnot. But the thing that you can see here from this diagram, and I know the print is really small, so I'm sorry about that, but there's lots of different options for each step. So the question remains, how do you build the optimal workflow? And as Andy alluded to, there's not going to be a single, answer to that question. It's really going to come down to not just the process, but the channel and, where the transaction is taking place. And whatever workflow you end up building, you should still expect to, monitor, test, refine, test again until you get the adoption that you want. And that's really the beauty of a digital process compared to your paper process, right? You have unprecedented visibility and analytics into what's happening. So you can analyze and see where the drop-off is occurring in your process and make the adjustments accordingly. And you don't have that same visibility on paper. So we're talking about flexibility in the workflow. So I'm not going to go through every single option here, but I just want to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. If we start on the left, think about how signers are accessing the transaction. So once the documents are handed off, how are the signers going to get in? How are they going to start e-signing? Are they going to get an email invitation? Obviously, that only makes sense if the signer's sitting at home. If the person's in person, that transaction is going to get launched from an embedded link within the agent experience web portal, for instance, in Andy's case. And the consumer is just going to be presented with either that swivel move that you described, Andy, or maybe they're going to be handed an iPad. Next, of course, in the workflow step, we need to figure out how are we authenticating or identifying signers. And this is the step, I would say, in the workflow where we often see companies get tripped up the most. There's an unfortunate tendency to place higher standards for security, have this perceived, higher risk in digital processes than the paper counterparts. And user authentication is the place where this happens the most. So you want to think about, consider the risk of a transaction. And ultimately, if a transaction is happening in person, whether you're e-signing or you're signing on paper, you're going to be verifying a government-issued identification. That's the standard for how we identify people in person. So that doesn't need to change. For remote signers, on the other hand, we consistently see the standard is to use 2-factor authentication. So the first factor in the authentication of a remote signer is going to be them getting an email with a link contained in that email. So the fact that they were able to receive the email to their personal email address is one step of verification, and combine that with either knowledge-based authentication, a one-time password maybe that's sent to a SMS text to a phone, or if the user is a returning visitor, you can just leverage the existing credentials and login that user has already for your website. So lots of easy, secure, and enforceable options for capturing identification. Moving quickly on, of course, the documents and disclosures need to be presented to the signer who's going to be reviewing and signing them. Most of the time this is done on screen, but there are some cases where a hybrid process makes sense. So you can allow customers to review documents on paper, but then tie the paper review back into an electronic signing process. So there's some flexibility and fanciness that you can look at there. You might want to capture some additional data in the form at the time of signing. The obvious use case for this among property casualty is in the uninsured, underinsured motorist form. We often have our customers have a checkbox at the time of signing. Or you might also want to use checkbox and additional fields at the time of signing for opting into additional coverage, optional additional coverage that they might have been being offered. And some of our customers, specifically in the insurance space, also use that next step in the process, which is document insertion or document upload capability. So if you think of an application where you might want to include a copy of a driver's license or evidence of membership in an association, so a AAA membership card, for instance, you can have those documents and those cards or those records scanned in or images taken of those documents, and that can be uploaded and made part of the e-sign transaction. Next, if we keep moving on to the right, is the sign step. That's how we capture intent, right? So again, we can click to sign or we can capture a handwritten signature image. And the law doesn't require one over the other, but usually that's going to come down to whether a touchscreen device is available or not. The most important thing there is you want to make sure that you're leveraging the existing devices that are available, and you don't want, as Andy was mentioning, you don't want to have to be worrying about, okay, do you have a phone with you and I'm going to send this to your phone, or, you want to make it as seamless as possible. And then finally, at the very far right, you want to make sure that all of the reliable, trusted, secured copies of the final e-signed records are available to everyone in the party, all parties to the transaction, to download. So that includes not just the insurance company, yourself, but also your end client, the end insured, as well as the broker and the agent. So everyone can get their own copy of those documents. But once again, once you've figured out the ideal option for each step in this workflow, and once you've implemented this, just really encourage you to test it out and see what's working and see where you can improve. Another best practice to keep in mind, we know, your company no doubt invests a lot in its brand. Your customers, your agents trust your brand. And that's why it's important, especially at the moment that you're asking your customers to sign on the dotted line, so to speak, that you're not introducing another third-party e-signature brand, for instance, into the process. You want to make the whole experience as seamless as possible. And what that means is we're talking about more than just making it possible for you to upload your logo to our platform or just changing the font and colors. You want to have complete control over the layout of the signer interface. You want to be able to customize the domains. For instance, the entire web GUI, all of the email and the text messages that are sent out to signers need to be customizable, not just in terms of content, but also in terms of sending domain. So you don't want your customers to receive an email from eSignLive, for instance. You want them to receive an email invitation from your company. And all of this is really important because it helps maintain trust between you and your end customers, right? The last thing you want is for a third-party e-signature vendor to be sending an email out to your customer and using their brand and their email domain, and potentially it's going to look like a phishing scam, and your customers are going to just ignore the invite, right? So obviously that would impact and affect those completion rates that Andy was talking about before, are near 90% for them. So, with white labeling, the end result is just a more trusted transaction, a better customer experience, and the end result, of course, is higher completion and adoption rates. So just to wrap up, I think, we saw in our earlier adoption stats that consumers are for sure ready for e-signatures, that the biggest challenge for us remains with our mediated processes, and that's why change management is as important as workflow considerations or white labeling or anything else. Now, I'm going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate to Andy. I know at the end of the day, Andy, you're mentioning that a lot of the communication efforts that you guys undertook was kind of falling on deaf ears, and that you weren't having a lot of success in that. I would challenge you to not completely walk away from the importance of taking these steps on, even if you are going to take a more authoritative and mandated approach to e-signatures. There's benefit in making sure that you have the communication, like you were saying, Andy, in the context of why this matters to the end agent, right? Why this change is being brought about, from their perspective. Whether or not that's going to drive the actual behavior that you're looking for is, I guess, a different question.
I think that's right, and I hope I didn't give the sense. I don't want to be dismissive about the proper communication strategy. You're talking to people that actually do the work in the agency, but you're also talking to agent owners. We had questions about legality from agent owners. We've had the whole gamut of questions, and we had, working with eSignLive and with counsel, a very comprehensive set of communications available for people that wanted to ask more questions. We had scripts for our sales reps. We took on that task in a very organized way, and that's why we've been able to basically double our adoption. Mm-hmm. The thing that I don't disagree with anything you're saying. I think that the issue is don't try to sell agents a value that they will not find compelling. Mm-hmm. Sell agents values they find compelling. What we figured out is that in our thing, ease of use is not a compelling value to a person that finds a wedding signature extremely easy to use. And so we continue to change and massage our messaging. And I guess probably to be fair, we didn't talk about this, but probably to be fair, just don't give up when you're first, when you're disappointed with your first layer of results. Just keep on working and changing the messaging. Don't be afraid to change the user interface, to your point earlier about the button. Just keep fighting the battle. Some use cases will have much better compliance than ours, even from the beginning.
Let me ask you, one of the bullets here mentioned, have you guys ever considered using incentives? Did you ever use incentives?
I do not think it is a good idea to incentivize a behavior that is sort of a compliance behavior. Where we do have people to change, if you'll recall earlier, I said where we do get people to use e-signatures for new business transactions, they start using it for everything. Mm-hmm. I think about sales incentives as a part of the rest of the job that I have to do in insurance anyway, and giving an agent an incentive for a behavior that is the right behavior all along. When you take the incentive away, I was very against us incentivizing that period. And I know other people may disagree with that, but it's the right thing to do is to get people to use electronic signatures. It's been my experience that you want to convince them of the value at the end of the day, not sort of bribe them.
Yeah, no, I agree. I invite anyone in the audience to, in the questions, just submit your feedback on whether you've used them. In my experience, we haven't seen a lot of insurance companies use incentives. I've seen it in a handful of cases, and typically it's usually that early adoption kind of just when it's just being rolled out, right? It's incentives more in a gamification kind of way, I would say, right? It's not for every new business transaction you e-sign, you're going to get X percentage back or something like that. It's more like after your first 10, e-sign transactions, you're going to be entered to win something, right? Just to make it a little bit more, fun for the agents. But the last bullet I do want to talk about on this slide is just training. And I know we have this sense that, training can if the workflow is ideal and it's really simple, why do we need to worry too much about training? We should just be able to put a video up on a website and they'll be able to understand what they have to do in a matter of a few minutes. And and even though we do absolutely want it to be simple, and it should be that simple, the truth is nothing is going to beat hands-on practice when it comes to an agent population. The last thing you want is for those agents or advisors to be only trying it out for the first time in front of a client, because if that's the case, they're going to be nervous and they're not going to feel comfortable giving it a try, and they're just not going to do it. So one of the best practices that we've seen a lot of our insurance companies do is they've built a sandbox for their agents, and they've allowed them, and in fact part of the training built in is to go up and to test this out in sandbox and get comfortable with it. Usually it takes about 4 to 6 times, is what we're seeing to get up the learning curve and get comfortable. So, and I know we only have 5 minutes left, so perhaps we should switch now to questions.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Andy. We are at the point now where we're going to answer some questions. If you have not had a chance to submit any, please do so at this time. In the interim, I'm going to go ahead and ask you all some questions. First question, how can e-signatures be used on a mobile app?
Oh, we could take a whole hour to answer that question. There's lots of different options for e-signing on a mobile app. So from a signer's perspective, the platform itself is completely browser-based, right? So everything is taking place if I'm a signer in a browser. So it's completely responsive, so it can be optimized for mobile devices in terms of navigation and everything. So any browser-based device is going to work from that perspective. On top of that, though, we also have apps. So we have an app for iPhone, iPad, and Android. But that app only really makes sense for users of eSignLive that are preparing and sending out packages. So for instance, an agent might potentially benefit from an app like that. So that's kind of the second option. And then the third option is we actually have mobile SDKs, so Android and iOS SDKs, that make it possible to build an e-signing component into your company's native apps. Where are we seeing this in insurance? There hasn't been a tremendous adoption yet of e-signing embedded into native apps. For new business transactions, if you think about it, we aren't seeing many insurance companies building apps for that, so that wouldn't make sense. But there has been more interest in integrating e-signatures into like claims apps is probably the one area where we've seen that more common.
Okay, great, Andrea, great. So the next question. A carrier sends a request to eSignLive, which then routes the document to the IA. IA then sends the request to the customer for e-signature. So I guess that they're just asking basically the overall process here.
Yeah, I can take that one, Andrea.
Go ahead.
In our use case. Jimmy, I assume you were asking how we do it. So again, it's at the end of our binding process. The action button initiates. It sort of used to initiate a PDF generation transaction that created the application for us. That still happens, but now an electronic signature package is spawned, both in the remote and the online experience. That package is spawned. If it's an in the office thing, that creates a little loop inside the world of the agency that sort of sends it right back to the same screen, and then that swivel happens, and the customer finishes signing the package, and then it's marked as being done. In the remote space, the package launches to the email that was provided by the customer. The customer receives that email, which drives them to a link. Customer, completes permission to sign. Not permission, the agreement to electronically sign. Then the next thing they get is the actual application or whatever the transaction is. They sign that, and when they're done, a copy goes to GAINSCO, a confirmation goes to the agent, and then whatever confirmation we want to go to the customer goes back to them. And all of that is e-sign. That's the guts of eSignLive, and there are smart people at the company that can help you understand that better than I just explained it. But what we did that was unusual is we modified the remote, the email path to work inside the agency, and they were able to help us do that.
Okay, great, Andy. Thank you so much for that response. I think we might have time for one more question. So let me just get to this one from Susan. And so customers need to be educated on what an e-signature is. This is where the legality aspect comes in. I have had people just type a name and think that is legal. Is just a typed signature legal?
Okay, so I mean, if you look at the definition of the eSign law, it's a very, very broad definition, right? And some people ask me, like, is your e-signature platform eSign compliant? And I say, well, yes, it is, but if that's all you're looking for, you're setting the bar pretty low. Because the truth is whether a typewritten name is legally acceptable from an e-signature perspective, what you want to look at is the rules of evidence, right? You want to think about how defendable is any given record or signature in the event of, number one, an audit, number two, a legal dispute and whatnot. So I'm with you 100%. I think you want to make sure that you're educating folks on the importance of making sure that a record is accomplishing the three things that you need an e-signature to accomplish, which is capturing intent, identifying a signer, and locking down a record, and then tying those three components together. And the truth is a typewritten, name at the bottom of a document doesn't accomplish those three things very well. So it's a topic for another day, perhaps, and we certainly have webcast recordings available on that topic specifically on e-signature laws that go beyond eSign, looking at the federal eSign law, but looking at enforceability of records. So if anyone's interested in getting a link to those, I'd be happy to share.
Okay, great.
Hey, guys, I tried to answer every one of those questions, so those answers should be up there, even if they're not great answers. I tried to get through it while we were still on the phone.
Thank you.
And thank you for that, Andy. And thank you, Andrea, for your presentation. We are still getting some follow-up questions, and we will go ahead and keep looking at those, and we'll be able to answer those as well after the event. In the meantime, that is all the time we have. I would like to thank everyone for joining us. We hope this was valuable to you. Also, a special thanks to Andy and Andrea for their time and insights. Thank you to eSignLive by VASCO for their support as well. If you missed any part of this presentation, remember it will be archived shortly so you can view it again or refer it to someone else. And have a great afternoon.